New Year greetings to everybody, and welcome to our next to our first seminar this year. So today we have a lecture, as I'm sure you know, by Frederik Kirch, who is going to speak about this, I think, the most controversial piece of equestrian equipment of all times, I guess, shanked bits. This is actually a piece of equipment about which even equestrians sometimes don't have clear idea how it works, what effect it has on the horse. I have been a rider for many years before I learned what a curb bit is and how it works. And the first time I learned was reading John Clark's book about horse equipment, which explains the mechanics of how it works. And by that time, I have already been riding for like 7 years. I think in all my career, maybe I used a curb bit twice, probably, possibly. But and I think we have even less understanding of what medieval shanked bits were and how they worked. I'm not sure about overseas audience, but audience in this part of the world, many people have been influenced. Some 10-15 years ago, there was a series of popular history programs about horses by Zorov, who explained that, like, throughout the history, people were cruel and took pleasure in torturing horses, especially using medieval curb bits. That was one of the main torture instruments. So
there is something in.
Whoever is speaking,
could you please not?
Okay, so some house rules. We will have a lecture for about 1 hour by Frederik, and then during this lecture, I would ask you to mute yourself. If you want to leave the video, it's fine, unless, well, but please remember, this will be recorded, right? So people will be watching it. If you have something improper in your background, feel free to switch off the video, but you can leave it on, no problem with that. Please make sure your microphone is muted throughout the lecture. And after this, we'll have a discussion, question and answer. We'll see how it goes. And then you can unmute yourself and either leave your microphones unmuted, or you can, I don't know, you can unmute when you are asking the question, depends on what kind of background noise you have. So now I will give the floor to Frederik, and I hope he will introduce himself.
Well, thank you. Just checking. First, I share the screen. Does everybody see it?
Yes.
And you hear me too? That's great. All right. My name is on the bottom left of the screen. And well, just to introduce myself, I'm an archaeologist working in the Department of Heritage Conservation of the state of Baden-Württemberg, in the south of Germany. And actually, my interest in medieval horse bits comes from different directions. First, I do reenactment for several years now. And as my beautiful wife got horses, I thought to myself, well, let's just introduce them to that hobby. And by that, I was keen to get more to know about medieval equestrian equipment. On the other hand, our department in the recent years excavated several very excellent preserved bits.
Historical
really,
horse bit.
Is everything okay? Okay. Okay. Yeah, our department excavated several very excellently preserved bits. really the top-notch stuff. And because nobody in our department really is very familiar with that sort of equipment, I try to write a little excavation paper about that. But as things usually go in archaeology, well, you keep digging, literally. And the whole project grew and grew, and I thought to myself, well, the literature is not that great. There are great examples of publications about medieval horse equipment, but they are rare. And so I thought to myself, well, we should do that on our own. And yeah, so that is the whole project which this lecture is about. But I will concentrate on the development of the form of the medieval shanked bit, and lots of other aspects I try to work on. We had to leave out because the time frame is simply not enough. So we won't hear anything about bit makers and the use of the bits in the medieval sources. So this will be a purely technical, typological lecture. So let's just get into it. The history of scholarly work that deal with this kind of equipment is actually quite long. For example, Viollet-le-Duc was one of the first who got this equipment, some passages in his famous Dictionnaire. And for example, German scholars soon followed. For example, das Handbuch der Waffenkunde by Wendelin Böheim. But as things were, they did not have that vast amount of actual bits at their hand. They worked with illustrations and bits they purely thought to be medieval. And that caused a lot of problems in the museal work in Germany and in Europe in general. Soon in the early 20th century, there is the famous publication of Schille and Forrer. Schille was an industrial who got a large collection of antiques and medieval armors, equipment, and other products of art. And Forrer was an actual archaeologist. And they tried to get the collection of Schille in order. So this was the first publication that dealt exclusively with horse bits or Pferdetrensen in German and their development. But as their source material was also quite narrow, we can nowadays clearly see that they followed lines of development that were not there or were dead ends, or they simply misdated many pieces. During the course of the 20th century, there wasn't that much attention to equestrian equipment. One reason is, of course, because simply not many archaeologists are riders, and therefore very interested in this equipment. They try to get the stuff, but they, like many other people, fall to misconceptions. There are other examples. For example, the you have to say famous work about the London finds by John Clark, who is also in the audience and hopefully joins us in the discussion. That for the first time try to sort the equestrian equipment in a modern and timely manner. For Germany, for example, there is another example of Norbert Goslar with his work of Reiter und Ritter, or in English, riders and knights, who try to form a typology of the whole bunch of equestrian equipment like spurs, stirrups, currycombs, bits, etc., and collected a whole lot of material and data from all over Germany. But as important his work is, many of his datings are to be reconsidered, to say at least, because he did not have the time to back his work up with an iconographic framework that serves as a big correction in the typology of bits, as we will see. So, but to get to the real stuff, when you go to lots of museums all over Europe and the British Isles, etc., you probably see I would say 80% of the museums who deal with medieval material culture, they have in their collection, or at least in their archives, medieval horse bits. And so there's plenty of evidence of medieval horse bits, or is it? The problem is, lots of museums still use, for example, these early 18th century publications like Viollet-le-Duc or Böheim to date their stuff. And so you have, for example, this bit on the top left from Burg Nürings in Germany that is supposedly from the 1360s because the castle was abandoned at that place. Or other bits like the one on the top right that is supposedly from the second half of the 15th century. And here you clearly see, if you have followed the line of these lectures and sessions, you can already see that these bits are not really medieval. Not only their form, but also their construction, like interchangeable mouthpieces, etc. These are techniques that we not really see in medieval times. So, if so many medieval bits and collections and museums are not medieval at all, why do we have so few medieval complex and shanked bits? Among many others, there are two main reasons. At first, shanked bits, in contrast to snuffles, are supposed to be associated with social elites. And the find spots that, for example, Goslar collected up to the 15th century have definitely a tendency to be castles, etc. So already in comparison to the other find places that we usually have, so flat countryside, rural villages, etc., already the find spots where we can usually expect shanked bits, they are scarce. Another very important point is that the losing ratio in comparison to other equestrian objects is depressingly low. And that is simply because shanked bits are quite large objects, while mounts, buckles, and even smaller bits might easily get lost in hay or gaps in wooden floors. They get tossed around, etc., and are never to be found again. This is not really a reasonable scenario with the large shanked bits that we have. And for example, contrary to horseshoes that get, even nowadays, as probably every rider can confirm, get lost regularly and are found literally in hundreds and thousands across medieval sites and context. And even spurs get lost during riding or travels, but the loss of the horse's bitting would probably be instantly recognizable for medieval people. And even that scenario was tried to prevent with lots of efforts, as bits were checked daily on weak spots, damages, etc. And the literal sources that we have, for example, the 12th century Ibn al-Awam with his agricultural guidebook advised, for example, a daily checking of the bits. And also King Duarte in the early 15th century advises strongly to check these bits regularly. And for example, these sources also state that the missing of a broken bit is actually way, way worse than, for example, just screw up the daily caretaking of the horse and don't groom it properly or stuff. But the good thing is there are maybe fewer medieval bits than we initially thought when looking at the museum's collections, but there are definitely more specimens to look at. Well, some common theories and repeated misconceptions about medieval shanked bits are roaming the internet, and sadly also academic publications. As I already told, not many archaeologists have any experience with horses, let alone ride them, let alone ride them in an historical manner, let alone ride them with historical equipment. So one of the many misconceptions is that curb bits appear suddenly, as the Bayeux tapestry shows, and we don't have really a clue. They appear out of nowhere. It was like a godly invention, and he said, "Let there be curb bits." So yeah, that is one of these misconceptions. The other is, and that angers me very, very often when I read that in academic publications, is that the reason they appear is connected to one-handed riding and the need for an efficient brake. But as probably every rider knows, your horse won't stop suddenly when you take your reins in one hand, even when you use a snaffle. It may not be the optimal way, but it is doable. And for example, many high medieval sources with Arthurian romances emphasize, for example, that Lancelot can use his horse with his legs alone and can use 2 weapons. Of course, that is an exaggeration, but it is based on the fact that you, of course, can steer your horse with your legs and your arse. The other thing of this two-pointed misconception is that it's connected to one-handed riding and the need for an efficient brake. And I just added a quote from the internet that I made anonymous, so not to insult anyone, but it's quite quite an example for these misconceptions. For, well, you see, stop there often not too well-schooled mounts, and it is possible by pulling both reins, and it may have been sufficient for medieval battles and tournaments, but not for the complicated movements of modern dressage competitions. Well, you see, you might have thought that a battle where other guys literally try to impale you with an ironclad tree is quite a challenge for the movements of horses, but you see, no, you're wrong, it's modern dressage. And yeah, to come back to Schiller and Forer, they already mention in the early 20th century the relationship to antique bits, but the 700-year interim from Roman times to the high medieval ages remained mostly inexplicable to them. So there are many questions to ask, and among others, and I try to answer these, at least in parts, is what were the predecessors, if there are any, and is there a continuous line of development traceable up to the Middle Ages? Are medieval shanked bits actually curb bits? When and why do they occur? And does art represent reality? So to get into medias res, we start, of course, with the Roman times. Rome is the light, and what have the Romans ever done for us? Initially coming from Roman archaeology, I have to say everything, but that is not entirely true. But concerning bits, there might be a grain of truth in it. So you see here 2 examples of Roman curb bits from the 1st and 2nd century AD. And you already see that there are different forms of mouthpieces. We have on the left this snaffle-like example, and on the right a bit that is already equipped with a very high port. Quite characteristic for these bits is that on one hand, the lower shank is usually bent in a backward curve, where the curve is aimed towards the rider. And these Roman bits have usually a quite massive bar that is on the transverse right up to the middle. But there are bits, usually the ones that have not such an extremely bent curve, that have even possibilities to change the position of this bar. Roman or antique artwork usually also shows these bits. We have this very fine example from Neuville-en-Sullias that shows the bit in all its extreme and fine manner. And also the many Roman tombstones. If they show the bit usually recognizable, we see that this curve is usually bent towards the rider and may do another curve so that they form some sort of an S. But to get back to these bits, the very big difference to later and medieval bits that these usually don't have really an upper shank or purchase, as you would call it. They have just this ring connection or this ring hinge. These rings might sometimes be oval like this, but usually you have just the bit itself and a shank that is that hangs low from there. But there are exceptions. For example, quite a unique find is the very famous Newstead bit. So you see the characteristic curve with the backwards bend, but the upper part of the bit is quite unusual. You see this ring bit has now changed to a very elongated form, where you would connect the cheek pieces of the headstall up here, and also the mouthpiece has a very distinct form with very sharp edges that definitely serves another purpose. But these bits are rare in antiquity. When we consider that probably most of the Roman frontier was guarded by equestrian units, infantry, for example, on the Upper German Rhaetian limes in Germany was quite rare. Most of them were auxiliary units that were mounted. We should expect more finds of these bits, and so the Newstead bit until now remains quite a unique find. So, concerning the dating of these bits, we are still around the 2nd and 3rd century AD. And yeah, we are thinking, how do we get up to, let's say, the turn of the millennium, 1000 AD? And actually, there is not that much evidence in the western part of the empire, let's say the Balkan, Middle and Western Europe. There really is not. So if the West denies us the evidence, we move to the East. And actually, we see with the Roman opponents in the 3rd and 4th century, like the Sasanians, we actually can see, well, they kept these shanked bits. You see them in this relief, and there are actually archaeological finds of these bits that are presumed 3rd and 4th century from Iran. And you see there are minor technological changes. So, for example, the curve in these bits is very extreme in comparison. The bar has been moved further down, and the U-shaped port has very much elongated. But as you see, the connection itself here, the ring hinge, is still quite loose. So there is a lot of ability to move the shanks within the ring connection. And this line of development goes further down. If we stay in the eastern provinces and Oriental art, we see in the many Toroitic works of this time, from the 5th up to the 7th century, that they just kept these shank bits. And the works themselves are incredibly detailed, but what we usually can't make out is an actual upper shank or purchase of the bit. So the construction itself remained the same like in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century. And well, we may change the medium and we go to ivory from metal, but if you look at these bits, we can still clearly see this backwards curve of the shank, but the upper shank is still missing. And even the very detailed icons of the 10th and 11th century, for example, from Georgia, they show lots of deep details about the equestrian equipment. But what we not really can examine is if there is an upper shank. The only example I really could find that might show an upper shank or purchase is the St. George from Paracati. But it might be something else. So the line of development is clear. These are these antique bits with not much of an upper shank. If we go to the west, let's say west of the Bosporus, so we include still Greece and the Balkans and parts of Eastern Europe, there is, as I said, not much evidence. And already Schiller and Faurer mentioned that, and they were very sad about that. The one piece of evidence they brought up is the so-called chess of Charlemagne, which they dated to the 6th century, which is odd enough for a chess piece of Charlemagne. But actually the dating was very off, and that is an 11th century Italy bit, and that will concur much better when we look at the form of these shanks with a later example. So this part of evidence is off the table. But there is evidence that already moves towards the bits that we will see later. For example, old digs often bring us new research and new evidence. For example, in the city of Justiniana Prima in southern Serbia, there were lots of bits excavated, but most of them are snaffles and other forms and derivates of that. But among a lot of bits, there were 3 examples that they at first couldn't really recognize until they found this example that is almost completely preserved. And I just made a quick sketch this afternoon of the bit, how it would look from the front. So you can see the bit itself is quite in this antique tradition. I mean, we are still just 300 years away from the first antique bits I showed you. But there is quite a technical innovation that we see, and it might not be recognizable at first. And actually it is, if you can see my mouse, it's this little knob here. And this little thing changes a lot in this bit. Because when you see, and we put this Y-shaped mouthpiece into the horse's mouth, and we now presume that the bit will rotate, this little knob will actually press against the mouthpiece and start moving. So now we have actually some sort of mechanism that moves the mouthpiece correlating to the movement of the shank of the bit. If we consider the position of this knob, you see there is not much space. It's actually this area here that would respond in, let's say 10 centimeters or something like that. So there's not much, very much time. And this might be connected why these pieces are all examples from Justiniana Prima are very thick. They are thick, heavy stuff in comparison to the earlier Roman pieces. And of course, the heavier the thing is, the more stable it will stay in its position until you start moving it. And this is actually the first thing that moves into the direction of medieval bits that we have. There is another example around about 100 years later that you probably are all familiar with if you are regular visitors to the Metropolitan website, as I am. And it's this famous bit from Spain that is dated to the 7th and 9th century in Andalusia. And you see, it actually still is, it's technically not a bit with lower shank and upper shank, but in German it's the word is Knebeltrense. I actually missed the English term now, but you guys will probably know what I mean. And you see that there is also this stop knob, although it is right now quite elongated. Funny little detail, you see these monograms up here. these are actually on one side the name of the owner of the horse, and on the other side the name of the horse. And there are several bits of this, probably of this workshop, although the other ones are simple snaffles, but they all have these lovely monograms of owner and name of the horse. So that's quite a nice detail. But to get back to the technical stuff, you see that this stop knob is now quite elongated. And if you move now your reins up here, the stop knob will move up and actually press against this hinged connection and press the mouthpiece up to the pallet. And if you follow the line of sessions, we already talked in the last session about the finds from the Portus Theodosicus in Constantinople, with where they found a bunch of horse skulls that have very similar fractures of the palate bone of the horse skull, and this only gets possible with this stop knob, because the antique bits themselves, they wouldn't have the leverage to press that hard against the upper palate of the skull. So I think we might have a nice connection between the archaeological record and the archaeological and zoological evidence that we have. Moving further up in time, we now move to our visioned time mark of 1000 AD, and then there is finally an upper shank and a purchase with a bit of El Castillon also in Spain, which is quite remarkable. And on the top right you have the comparison again with the Metropolitan piece and the piece from El Castillon, which is quite remarkable, as you see the extreme length of the upper shank or purchase, and the connection with the lower shank. You see the mouthpiece is quite similar to the pieces from Justiniana Prima. It's this very thin bar, and not this spade-like thing that we've seen here before. Which is also interesting is that they added to the transversal bar this spiked stuff. So if we think about the way these antique bits work, and I just realized I didn't talk about that. So this transversal bar is usually used to make contact to the chin groove of the horse. And therefore they have this extreme backward curve, because if you have a straight connection between your rider's hand and your horse's mouth, you need this backward curve to actually make contact with the crush bar. And so we see here in this example that they actually thought, well, this is not enough. We need more contact and make it actually more feelable for the horse. And these things also appear in artwork. For example, in not that much time difference in the Beatus di Liabena, we see these spikes that are on top of this transversal bar that is aimed to make contact. 100 years later, roundabout, there is another example that is clearly the same type from Lietor. So we already see that there is quite a concentration of these early bits in Spain. And well, it might be just the academic situation and coincidence, but it might also be that these bits are actually made their comeback and used Spain as a starting point. But we have to examine the archaeological evidence further. But as we see, the type of mouthpiece is still the same. The purchase and upper shank is very long and goes up to the eye and maybe even beyond. And the lower shank actually takes this backward bend to the extreme and just makes a right angle with a very massive transversal bar. So here we have finally, shank bits like we would nowadays define them, with an upper purchase, a lower shank, oder Oberbaum und Unterbaum, as you would say in German. And now we have actually medieval bits, not only by time, but also by type. Here are some details of this very beautiful bit. It's encrusted with yellow and silver inlays. It has an Arabic inscription, usually with this theological impetus, and also the contemporary sources mention these extremely lavishly adorned silvered and gilded bits. And if we have to ask ourselves, does the iconography follow? Yes, it actually does. This is, I would say, the earliest example of a curved bit, or I shouldn't say curved bit, of a shanked bit that I could find earlier than 1000 AD. You see, we have these extreme lengthy upper perches or upper shanks and the lower shank with this typical U-shaped bar. Well, 100 years later, the picture gets clearer, and finally we are in the sphere that already the early scholars were familiar with. And of course, we have to mention the famous Bayeux tapestry. And shank bits are abundant on the Bayeux tapestry. They are, if I remember correctly, only not used where they use snaffles is in a very early hunting scene, the chronological order. But in all the battle scenes, we just see these shank bits, and you can understand now why the early scholars came up to their reasoning that these are battle bits and not used in other circumstances, because they concentrated on sources like the Bayeux tapestry. But as I wrote, 100 years later than the bits of Lietor, the picture gets clearer, not only because the iconographic record gets clearer, but also because suddenly these things pop up like crazy. And it's mostly we mostly have to thank the French archaeological colleagues that undertook lots of digs in the past 20 years and dug up lots of these bits. It has something to do with heritage laws, but well, that's not the point right now. The point is, we have now a real bunch of bits that we can compare to each other. And from a first look, you can clearly see that they share common features, like the curved lower shank, sometimes even more than a right angle, and also the mouthpieces are quite similar. If you have seen the lectures from John Clark and Jennifer Jobst the last time, you can also connect these pieces to the written sources from Jordanus Rufus and stuff. And what is really amazing is that these bits are so similar in their mouthpiece. There might be minor differences, but after all, it's mostly the same type. What differs in these bits, and this might be a chronological marker, is the length of the perches. If you remember the earlier bits from the 9th and 10th century, you've seen that these perches are very long. And these tend to get shorter, and we will see why. Because we have to think about how did these pieces actually work. And if we look at the artwork of this time, that is usually not that detailed, there are a few exceptions that can show us the way how these bits functions. For example, this Chronik Otto von Freising from the mid-12th century. You see the curve of the lower shank and also this bar that is already quite narrow up to the chin, but the reins are not that pulled straight, and the horses have quite, they are not in high flight mode, nor are they very behind the vertical. So this would be quite a normal posture of these horses. And we have other postures where we see these bits in other actions. For example, from the Cathedral of Angoulême, we have this scene from the Chanson de Roland, where we see this curved lower shank that already is behind the chin groove of the horse. But if you would imagine any further rein pulling, would not change the position of this shank anymore. So actually the position of the horse has to be considered when we think about how these bits work. And we have this scheme made from Nicolas Portet in his publication about the bits from Andon. And first you see how these bits are lying in the horse's mouth. And we have now here the bit in a quite relaxed position. And now what happens when the reins are pulled up? So the transversal bar is positioned right here. And you see if you would pull it further, the lower shank rotates and the transversal bar goes up to the chin groove. In this position, there wouldn't happen much further if you wouldn't pull any further. So this position is okay for the horse. And the horse also can control the position of the mouthpiece and the position of the transversal bar and how it works by itself. When the horse is in high flight mode with his head up and, well, nothing goes anymore, I'm off, you see that already quite a bit of rein pulling would result in quite a drastic contact. On the other hand, if the horses start to get behind the vertical, pulling the reins themselves doesn't work anymore concerning the transversal bar. But in this position, the mouthpiece itself would still work. Yeah, so we see, although the early hinge bits are constructed without a device for true leverage action, for example, experiments by Jennifer Jobst showed a slight upward movement of the mouthpiece when this type of bit is engaged. The ratio of engagement might be influenced by several factors. For example, the headstall. Its fitting, is it very tight, is it loose? Its material, is it leather or is it very stretchable fabric, for example? And the sources mentioned that, for example, silk is often commissioned and also cotton, as headstall is mentioned in sources from the Teutonic Order. But also the bit itself might affect the ratio of this contact. For example, the form of the hinge. Are the rings very tight? Are they loose? The angle of the curved lower shank, the weight and the stability of the lower shank, and foremost, the length of the purchase. Because the longer the purchase is, for example, with the 9th century examples that goes up to the eye, the potential area where it can move up without stretching the headstall itself is more limited than if the purchase is quite short. And now I will have to show you a video that Jennifer showed me with her new
We do not see the video now.
All right. So you so we see also the position and the weight of the mouthpiece of the bit itself might affect the movement of the mouthpiece and also affect the contact of the transversal bar. There are other experiments, for example, from Anne Hyland in 1990, and she experimented with a Newstead bit. But their premise was to see if this transversal bar is actually meant to make contact to the chin groove. And she made, in my eyes, a few errors. For example, the bit itself is put on backwards. So this curve, like the sources tell us, should aim like this. And also the headstall, as you can see here on this ring, is not really tightly fitted. But as we've seen with the video of Jennifer, there is actual movement of the mouthpiece. It might be not as much as with true leverage action, but there is movement. And that the contact to the chin groove of this transversal bar was actually aimed for can be seen in other examples, like bits from Andon, where they changed the lower shank. The initial transversal bar is quite low, and on a secondary stage, they actually added a second transversal bar that is really, really close to the hinge. So this bit would make contact to the chin groove of the horse from very, very early on. So we've seen now that from I would say the 9th century on, we have actually medieval shank bits, but they are not curb bits. And why? Because they simply had no curbs. But within the second half of the 12th century, we can see actual curbs in artwork. For example, with this lovely aquamanile from the Musée des Arts Décoratifs, that is extremely detailed. And we can see the connection to the headstall of the mouthpiece. We have to imagine the ring hinge, the lower shank, and we can clearly see that there is something like a curb that is moving down below the chin of the horse. And this happens round about the second half of the 12th century, probably more towards the end of the 12th century, because suddenly from 1190, 1180 onwards, these things can be seen quite regularly. For example, with a very, very detailed picture at the Chartres Cathedral. It's an image of the awakening of the three Magi, and we can now also make out some technological details, like that the curb is a really curb bar. It's not a chain like many people imagine. It's a curb bar, and it's actually connected to the to the purchase or the upper shank, and not like in modern curb bits with this eyelet up here. And what we see here, it might slip your attention, but what we see here is quite an interesting feature, because as you can see, the lower shank would in this instant move quite freely until it makes contact to this bar that moves, that leads from the upper purchase down here. And from now on, this thing will blockade the rotation and be a hindrance to the further movement of the lower shank. Because with this bar, from now on, if you pull any further, the whole headpiece will move up. And suddenly we not only have curbs, but we have actual leverage action. And the feature of actual leverage action makes quite a comeback as the stop knobs return. They have been ditched in the archaeological record and iconography for around about 300 years, and suddenly they are back. There is this way of creating the leverage action via these bars, but more usual and most all of the bits from the 13th century onwards have these little stop knobs. So if you imagine pulling this U-shaped lower bar further up, if you take on your reins, this stop knob will press against this thing and move the whole mouthpiece and upper purchase towards the palate of the horse. There is quite a discussion if okay, sorry, we have another video I simply forgot from Lisa Marieke Curer, who has also a reconstruction of a hinged bit with stop knobs. So you can see here, you can move these lower shanks quite freely, and nothing really happens to the mouthpiece. But if you move to the contact point, they blockade, and the whole mouthpiece will move. So let's get back There is quite a discussion if these curb bars were earlier or the curb chains. And there is very little evidence because we have nowadays more medieval pieces than we would have expected 20 years ago, but seldomly the curb bar is preserved, and also the chain. But we luckily we have a few examples from very early dates, so we are quite sure that the curb chain and the curb bar seem to be in use in the same time frame from early on. Although the curb bar, like this example from Cystic, seems to be the dominant form up to the 15th century. And from the late 14th century on, up to the 15th century, this system will be changed again a bit, as there is a combination of both methods. We have a massive bar right here, connected with small parts of chains with a purchase, and usually they are connected with smaller plates with several holes, so that you can also adjust the tightness and the fit of this curb bar. So from this date on, from the 13th century on, the amount of preserved medieval bits rises and rises again. They are still very rare, but we have now several pieces, so we can start to compare, for example, mouthpieces, construction, etc. And usually one has to think that the mouthpiece and the form of the bit itself, like John Clark and Jennifer told us in the last session, theoretically is interchangeable. As Rufus explains us, you use this mouthpiece for this horse, etc., etc. But there seem to be certain chronological tendencies. For example, in the 13th century, we have these bits with the very high ports more often than other forms. And in the 13th, 14th century, we have, for example, other forms that might derive from the earlier forms of the 11th century that we thought, but are already changed a bit. And also, for example, the position of the mouthpieces, like do they start right at the hinge or do they start further up, etc., shows from now on a lot more variation than in earlier times. And there are, for example, very elaborate bits like the ones that Todt published in 1926 from the Hungarian National Museum, that are also preserved with parts of the headstall that are metal applications. And yeah, you see that dating these bits was quite difficult in the early 20th century, with not a lot of specimens to compare them with. For example, the iconography of these curb bars tends to a much earlier date than the 13th, 14th century date that these bits are nowadays dated to. And also what is quite complicated is simply understanding these bits, as we see in this reconstruction from an Osprey series book from David Nicol from the late 1980s, where you can see that they actually put the curb bar as a nose ring on the horse and the headstall as part of the reins. And these errors still happen from time to time, even in modern publications, but this is simply due, as I already told, that not many archaeologists do ride or have a deeper understanding how horses move or how equestrian equipment is actually used. What is also nice, and what we tend to forget, that these bits were, as we said, usually high-end equipment from social elites, and they were richly adorned. We have this example from also the Hungarian National Museum, and usually you don't have an upper purchase where you can distinguish different forms. With these early hinge bits, it's quite difficult to actually form a typology from the upper purchase or the upper shank alone. And these are rare specimens where we actually have something to work with. And for example, we have here this decoration here with this rectangular decoration, which finds itself in another example from France, from Ferrand-Tardenois, that is also quite richly adorned. And when you see the detail, this bit was gilded over and over and set with precious stones, and the state it is nowadays in can probably only be a glimpse to the splendor how these bits were used in the past. And if you look at medieval inventories and bit makers, lists, etc., gilded and lavishly adorned bits are actually usually more the rule than the exception. So we move up to the 14th century, and the hinge bits are still going strong. There are, for example, extreme hinge bits, like this example, that shows a theory that is quite often recited concerning later bits, and that is the contact of the horse with the lower shanks onto his breast. But from the 14th century on, the iconographic evidence of true hinged bits is in its demise. And from now on, we have a new, very innovative phase from the bit makers who are trying to go into new way, try to go new ways with their bit development. And there are several ideas. For example, in the very inventive 14th century, is, for example, that they add these B attachment to bits. As I said before, usually hinge bits are not really, you are not really able to do an iconographic typology through the hinge bit alone, because usually you just have one line that is the upper purchase and nothing else. But with these B-shaped bits, we can actually now recognize this type quite directly. And if you are tracing this type back, you end in the late 13th century. So technically, the innovation began a bit earlier than the 14th century, but in this time they really start. And one of the earliest evidence that we have for this type is, for example, icons from the Levante coast, from the monastery of St. Catherine on the Sinai mountain, where we also can see still a very common hinge bit construction. We see also the metal curb bar, the massive curb bar, and these B-shaped mounts that are up here. At first, when I found this reference, I was quite intrigued that, well, maybe this evidence might actually be a trace that this type originates in the Near East. But the thing is with the icons of St. Catherine that they are all made by Italian artists, and most other evidence that we have, iconographic evidence that we have for this type, also comes from the early 14th century Italy. But what is quite interesting is that suddenly these B-shaped mounts are serving a certain purpose, because suddenly they are adding false reins. And that is something that we haven't seen in 500 years of medieval bit technology before, and suddenly they start using them with false reins. And also, additionally, these B-shaped mounts are serving as a protection measurement for the horse, because the upper purchases get longer, and the hinge starts to wander towards the horse's lips. And these B-shaped mounts are preserving direct contact with the lips, that the lips or other soft tissue gets caught in this hinge construction. For example, when I think about my horse that is extremely mouthy and gets everything between his lips, he would actually need something like this to prevent him from getting caught in that. Another idea that the bit makers have in the 14th century is that they change these bits and get something that we did not have before, and that is instant leverage. For example, we have here this example from Bordesley Abbey, and usually you would say, well, the mouthpiece is quite unusual, but in all other aspects, at first sight, you would say, well, that is a normal mouthpiece, a normal hinge bit with a B-shape mount. But when we look at the lower part, we actually see that they bent the hinge to the front and ditched the hinge construction and riveted it solidly. So now we have actually something that resembles a modern curb bit with a solid purchase and shank. On the other hand, these B-shaped mounts bits still happen to come around in the 15th century, and we have several pieces of artwork that show these bits. For example, here from the Cappella dei Magi, from the Palazzo Medici, and also here we see this two-rein construction with a bit. And there are other examples, for example, from Pisanello, etc. And the interesting thing is that in the 15th century, we usually see these bits only with mules and donkeys in an ecclesiastical context. So maybe there has been a transformation of meaning, or the use of these bits as maybe quite old-fashioned bits that were now only fitting for the clerics. But to come to the other big idea that I missed foliage, sorry. The way these bits move, for example, with the example from Bordesley Abbey, is that they are moving to solid shanks, a solid purchase and a solid lower shank in a one-piece construction. And this is also shown in the artwork. From the very, very late 14th century to the very early 15th century on, for example, in this manuscript, where we see clearly the origins of this construction, but the hinge is completely gone, and we now have a modern bit in a one shank construction. The other idea is, well, we don't like the hinge anymore, let's fix that. And we have two famous examples from New York and Turin that clearly show that the hinge construction is still there and it's theoretically movable, etc. But these bits have iron bars and brackets that come down from the purchase and fix the movement of the bit in a certain position. Recent publications are trying to examine the reason behind that, and there is an assumption that the position of this shank would make, for example, the blue angle would make the bit stronger, the green neutral, and the red position would make the bit weaker. Actually, I'm not that a good writer and not that firm in historical equitation and all the finesse that is behind that. But if we think about this assumption, we have actually go to the physics of curb bits. And well, there is now a bit of math, but we get through this very fast. So the usual physics behind a curb bit or any lever actually is that force and the length of the arm equals the force and the length of the arm, the upper arm. And if you do it as an angled lever, the actual length of this arm shortens. So the bit would get weaker. But physics is always complicated, and I sucked at it at school, so it is complicated. And we have to consider also the direction where force is applied. And usually it's not, if this would be the bit, it usually is not a direct force that goes to the boots of the rider, but it's an upward movement. And therefore, it's actually not the lower shank that is shortened, but the upper shank. And then the bit is actually stronger than it was. But we also have to consider that the force is applied on the curb bar or curb chain that would be positioned right here. So we have lots of other forces and directions to consider, but what we can say is it's not simply as make the bit weaker or stronger. If we look at later manuscripts and equestrian riding manuals, etc., and I'm sure there are lots of people in the audience that can explain the mechanics behind that way better than I can. But if we look, for example, at later manuals, it's mostly, and they mention that quite oftenly, that it's more mechanism to sort the position of the head. For example, if we look at the Grenier with his ligne du banquet, we have these positions of the shank to direct the position of the horse's head from in front of vertical, behind the vertical, etc. So if it was not to make the bit weaker or stronger, what was the sense behind these fixed bits? If not the regulation of the horse's head position, it surely was to come to instant leverage, as we have seen on the bit from Bordesley Abbey. And here is another example of these hinged bits. It's from France, from Castle of Étrigny. And we see here that the features are exactly the same. We have an upper purchase, we have still the old school curb bar, and these massive brackets that also change the weight of the bit more to the backside, and that might regulate the horse's head position also. And we can also see that they already ditched the stop knob. So this bit doesn't have any, and it doesn't need one because they have these iron brackets that regulate the bit to have instant leverage. If we pull the reins here, the upper purchase will instantly move towards the pallet. And if we follow the line of development, we can clearly see the next step to the solid shank bits. These are examples from Eastern Europe, and they feature something that in archaeology you call a typological rudiment. So it's actually a feature that former forms did have, but it serves no function anymore. Because as you can see in this example, the purchase and shank are now a one-piece construction, but we still have an iron bracket that is connected to the bit here. Although this bracket itself wouldn't serve any purpose anymore. And just to illuminate this really interesting bits, there is the illumination from a manuscript from the Vatican Library, from a Rusius manuscript, and you can clearly, beside the typical form of the mouthpieces, we can also see these little hangers that are probably serving decorative purposes or other. I'm not really sure about that yet. And if we follow this type along, we come finally to true curb bits, as we would call them today. For example, there is, we see in the second half of the 14th century clearly the decline of hinged bits. You still see them from time to time in artwork, but they disappear rather quickly. And so this new type of construction seems to be very successful and seems to be accepted by riders all over Europe quite fastly. So we have, for example, this example that comes out from the art market. So it's not really dated, but I would date it to possibly the late 14th century, because we still have this typological rudiment, although the bracket already is gone, and now it's just this stabilizing bar here. And then we have a very early published example from Castle Tannenberg in Germany, and other iconographic evidence from the early 15th century shows that this type is around for quite a long time, although it is quite simple. And yeah, what we also see with the development of these actual curb bits with a solid chain construction is the development of split mouthpieces, like ordinary snaffle mouthpieces. This correlates also to, for example, written sources. As I mentioned, the Rufus edition from the lands of the Teutonic Order that was written in the late 14th century and published in the republished in the early 15th century mentions, for example, that split mouthpieces with a middle what's the term? The middle hinge of the mouthpiece are seen to be the weakest, although quite common. And then with the 15th century, the line of development splits into a whole bunch of different types and forms. And right now I'm trying to get a grip from that. So I'm doing an iconographic catalog and typology, and I will just show a few of them so that you see that in contrast to the assumption that the medieval bits in artwork of the 14th and 15th century are purely fantastical and derived from the imagination of illuminators because they were not so connected to the equestrian sphere, it clearly shows that artwork, especially in the 15th century when the artwork gets more detailed, they clearly show the real deal and existing pieces. For example, we have what I call type Steppen, that is dated around about the 1430s to the 1470s. That gets his name from the Steppen altarpiece nowadays in Stuttgart. So any German folks that try to visit me here in Stuttgart, let's get a look if this pestilence is over. And this type is quite common in the European archaeological record. For example, we have the example from Burg Tüschnitz. We have an example from Sweden. There are several German examples, for like this one from Burg Bartenstein, which luckily has also the mouthpiece attached. And there are alone several pieces from Baden-Württemberg alone. Like the very excellently preserved bit and gilded bit that I mentioned before that I sadly cannot show you right now, but it will be published one day. And these examples that we have show also the difficulty in the connection of mouthpiece and shank construction itself. For example, you see here in the two examples from Burg Tüschnitz that are dendrochronologically dated, so quite surely date to the 1430 and 1455. You see although the type is the same, mouthpieces might differ. So we have here different constructions like this single bar that is probably connected to a rather simple snaffle piece with several parts or just a two-piece snaffle. But we also have these three holes that Goslar couldn't make much sense of. And the example from Burg Bartenstein now shows us clearly how these three holes might have been used with this multi-piece construction. And also when we look at the Stettner altar piece, you can clearly see that this might be one of the many possibilities how the mouthpiece of this type or in this example from the Stettner altar piece might be constructed. Other existing pieces are also very clearly connectable to contemporary artwork, like a bit that I put into the type of La Ghent that can be dated to the first half of the 15th century, which is an excellently preserved bit also from France. And there you can see also this bar chain construction and the adjustable plates that are hanging from the upper eyelet, so to adjust the strictness of the curb bar. And you can clearly see that this type is the one that is seen in the famous Ghent altar piece. What we also see in this one is a so-called hollow bit or Hohlpiece, Hohlbiss in German. And these appear from the 13th century on. The pieces of snaffle bits in this time frame, they are only the snaffles, not connected to curbs. They tend to get bigger. Formerly, they were solid shanks and often of a rectangular shape. They tend to get bigger, and in the 14th century, we finally get these really thick snaffles that are usually made hollow. And these also appear in the written record in inventories and bit maker orders, for example, from France, and for example, the inventories of Charles VI. We have several incidents of mort creux, which translates to hollow bits. And these are actually the ones that we see here. And the 15th century horse equestrian manuals and horse treatises mention a lot these Hohlbisse to fill in, like Rufus already says, although he just means to smear the honey on the bit. These are actually able to be filled. And another type that derives from we have one existing specimen from Castle Bodelshausen, also in Baden-Württemberg, so we are quite blessed with existing 15th century curb bits. This castle got destroyed in 1450, and there is a very lovely example from the contemporary artwork from Scharenstetten that is also showing the distinct features of this bit with very strict rectangular lines. And I think we can clearly say that the question to do these bits in artwork reflect reality can clearly be answered as yes. And like archaeological and armor research shows in the last years, I think we have to ditch the thought that altar pieces, etc., are purely fantastic and biblical imaginations of the painters. They based their artwork on the reality they lived in, and we clearly see that in art and the existing pieces. Which might be interesting, and this piece is that with the 15th century going on, we see different constructions of rein attachment. So, for example, here you see that the second rein to the snaffle D-ring is not directly attached to it, but forms actually part of the headstall. And I'm pretty sure other people like Arne Kutz or other experts in actual historical writing might explain to us later in the discussion the meaning or the advances that this construction might have to other rein attachment constructions. But we can clearly see that the innovation phase did not stop in the 15th century and clearly goes on. When we come to the very late 15th century, there are also other types that are well represented in art, and also in the archaeological record there are examples from the Siege of Neuss. So these bits are quite good, quite exactly dated. And with these historical drawings, you see the state of the pieces has suffered a bit in the last 100 years. But we can still make out a lot of details of the construction. And as I said, this innovation phase of the 15th century did never stop. So, for example, we have this St. Maurice from Soultz in eastern France, where you can see, quite an exotic combination of a true curb bit with a solid purchase and shank construction, but that shows also an additional hinged part that is added to the lower shank, and with a 3-rein construction with 2 reins leading to the lower part of the hinge construction, the actual lower shank, and a third ring that goes to the D-shaped snaffle ring, like with type Bodelshausen, and connected to the headstall, with another piece of the headstall that is connected to the upper end and eyelet of the purchase. So we see that with this, so with this feature, you have a lot of possibilities to get into contact with your horse. And what is also quite visible is that this is a very finely adjusted instrument. It's not the effective brake that former scholars used to think about it. This is a very finely tuned instrument to get into contact with your horse with the slightest amount of rein pressure, positioning of your hands, etc. And so to get into a last glimpse, I think we can say, especially with equestrian equipment, that the Middle Ages are quite long-lived. And just for a last glimpse, I show you a picture from the bit book of Mangseuter from the late 16th century, who says about this bit that we now, after this lecture, can clearly see as a derivative from the early hinge bits. And it has quite Renaissance features, like the ornamental and floral decorations and the form of this D-shaped ring that is like typical for the 16th century, now more pear-shaped than like the omega shapes we've seen before. But Mangseuter himself writes about this bit, for example, well, it's, I paraphrase it now, it's a bit weird and the shanks are odd and that is old-fashioned. And I think you could use it for young horses, as he was quite familiar with Rufus and Rusius, who use this type of mouthpiece for young horses. But, you know, I suggest changing the shanks to something more contemporary. So this might explain that Mangseuter probably did see an actual medieval bit that was around until the 16th century, but I'm not that sure that these bits are actual late 16th century bits that they try to use. But John Clark is also on the trace of that, and yeah, that is now the end of my lecture. And I hope it wasn't, well, it was a bit too long, but I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We certainly enjoyed it, and I don't think anybody minded that you ran over like 10 or something minutes.
Okay.
So, any immediate questions? People could put the questions in the chat, or they can raise their hand or unmute themselves and speak. What I liked is the fact that at the beginning of your lecture, you mentioned a very interesting question: how well were medieval war horses schooled? And that's something probably we can never know. But the suggestion that they weren't well schooled, you couldn't stop a horse with one hand. I have a thoroughbred which isn't very well schooled. I have never done dressage with her, but I have been able to ride one-handed in a bitless bridle, and turning and stopping her and doing doing a bit of mounted sparring. So I don't think you need to have a very well-schooled horse for that.
Okay,
there is a question
from Xavier.
So Xavier, you can unmute yourself and kind of speak.
Yeah, hello, do you hear me?
Yes.
So yeah, great lecture and great work being done there. It's really important that this kind of work happens, I think. Now my question was actually about the origins of the curved bits and the shank bits, or even the spade kind of bits. Am I correct to see that we only see them really appearing in the 11th century in medieval Europe? And related to that, have you actually also looked at the Byzantine bits? Because I noticed that for the earlier medieval, the 8th and 9th century types, you mostly looked into Spain. And I was actually wondering whether you also have looked at Byzantine types, because that might possibly also be an interesting relationship to look into, this exchange between Byzantine and post-Carolingian Europe.
Yeah, that is actually true. The problem about that is that publications about Byzantine bits are hard to grasp, actually, and the only thing that we have now, this heavy Spanish part in the line of development is simply because that we simply have these finds from Spain and the publications have already been done. And actually, I'm not that familiar with modern Turkish publications that, for example, that deal with extant archaeological bit finds from the time frame that you are mentioning. So, if you know any publications about these that you are familiar with, I would gladly see them. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer. Other questions, comments, suggestions? I would actually be interested to know if somebody has tried using a reconstructed medieval bit on a horse and what was the impressions.
Well, probably Jennifer can jump into this. For example, the bit I showed from Lisa Marike Küre from Germany, who reconstructed the hinge bit with a stop knob. She used her aim was at first to reconstruct simply the mechanism of the stop knob. So she used a modern mouthpiece. So we shouldn't take any hints from the movement of the mouthpiece of that reconstruction to reconstruct our view of the medieval pieces. But for the earlier hinged bits, I think Jennifer did a reconstruction, and I've seen videos where she put it in her horse's mouth. But probably she can tell us more about that, so maybe she wants to join.
Jennifer, do you want to join?
Well, yes, I can. Frederik, could you pull up the slide that you have of the portet and the pine hill and all of those bits? Just to show which one. And yes, I did put it on my horse. I've had it for about 48 hours right now. So I really can't say a whole lot about it other than the things that I've noticed so far, and my horses don't typically wear bits like this, so we've just sort of put it on them for a few minutes to see what the action is like and how they react. What I can say is that the position of the bar, the transversal bar on the hinge part, makes a very big difference. We have one horse who has a slightly, so the bit that the reproduction that I had made is sort of a combination of the La Chapelle bit and the Pine Hill bit, because the La Chapelle bit is missing. There we go. So the La Chapelle bit in the middle is missing a bar in the mouthpiece. So those two little rings on either side, there would have been a bar between them, like you see on the Pine Hill bit. So it's sort of a combination of those two, and it was made to the specific measurements of the La Chapelle bit on the bottom center. The interesting thing, though, is the transversal bar across on the hinge. We have one horse that they've actually all got very similar head sizes, but one horse has a longer jaw between sort of the bar of the jaw and the front incisors. And we actually noticed that the hinge, when it sort of swings down, actually hit his front incisors on the bottom when the bit was in a neutral position. So obviously it was not in the right place for that horse. Another horse that we tried it on, the transversal bar hung okay, when it was in neutral, but it got stuck on his chin. So it wouldn't sort of move up into the curve groove under his chin. It got stuck on the fleshy part under his chin. So those are just kind of very, very beginning observations, and I don't feel like I can comment very much about it, but certainly the construction is interesting, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it works.
Yeah, thank you. So we had a couple of comments in the chat. So Arne commented on the rain through the ring having a gorge effect. I don't know if Arne wants to elaborate on that or not. Yes, please.
Yes, please. Feel free to unmute yourself and speak.
Hello. Yay. Is it working?
Yes.
Hello.
Yes. Hi. I just would want to say that that's a basic gag effect that is often used with polo these days. So where you basically pull the top of the head towards the mouth, pull it together basically by pulling the headstall tighter, if you will. And that is usually mentioned to be a raising effect of the head. But that is a very complex thing, so it's always a bit tricky to make those quick statements. So you would have an opportunity to turn from the curb effect, but you could also have an effect like this, which might help you bring the head back out if the horse wants to go too far. But again, so circumstantial. So, but it's generally known as a gag effect. So it's widely used today.
Okay,
thank you.
Also, there was a comment from Timothy that, well, back in those days when we started our horse sessions at the International Medieval Congress, I think it was Gail who brought a replica of a curb bit or hinged bits, which has been used for television, I think, and Gail still has this replica, and she's used it on one of her New Forest ponies. It's quite small, so it would only fit a pony.
Is that this time team bit by any chance?
I think it was, yes.
Okay.
And Gail had it on a pony which was ridden by a child who also had played polo, and she said it worked very nicely. The pony didn't mind it, although it was the first time. So, positive effect.
Yeah, I think most people are quite shocked when they see these huge ports, and for example, with these 11th century bits, these long bars. But yeah, as I've said, I've seen the videos from Jennifer's horses, and apart from the fact that the transversal bar on the chin groove is a bit too narrow for this horse, the mouthpiece itself wasn't that a big deal from my impression. They seemed rather comfortable with it.
I think the biggest objection that they had with the mouthpiece is that it does compress the tongue, which they're not used to because they're used to going with either a single straight bar or a French link style, snaffle bit, and I usually will bridle my horse, and then I will give them a small treat or cookie or sweet. And the thing that I've noticed is none of them can eat it. So they'll work it in their mouth for a minute, and then they eventually have to drop it. And I think that's because the movement of the tongue is limited by the mouthpiece.
I think you could try sugar.
Probably I could, but my vet would yell at me.
Okay, because in Latvia people do it all the time, and I've been told by my riding instructor you should do it before a dressage competition because they will have white foam, which looks nice, rather than having brown foam, which doesn't look nice on the horse. So in Latvia people are less against this.
Yeah. I have one horse with some dental issues, so we try not to feed straight sugar. But yes, I know that's a very good suggestion, actually.
Because I've done it with young horses when they cannot chew something. When I was putting the bit for the first time on the young horse, they just tend to spit out the cookies, and if you give them some sugar, then they don't need to chew it. So, and I mean, Rufus mentions honey. So, but yes, Arne has a question in the chat about if the double bar mouthpiece might help prevent a tall port or tongue spike to race overlay. So, Frederik, any ideas? Somebody.
Well, yeah, that might be the reason, because we always have to remember that the rotation axis is always the lowest part of the mouthpiece. It might also make balancing the bit in the mouth easier for the horse, as in the video from Jennifer we already saw if the horse would balance the bit itself, the rotation of the mouthpiece would be disabled. So there are probably several reasons to do the double mouthpiece, but once again, I'm just forming the typology. The historical writers have to do the conclusions about the forms themselves. I'm not that good at imagining the reaction of the horse because I'm not that familiar with that amount of historical writing as other people have. So maybe Arne can jump in again and elaborate his thoughts about that.
Okay, Arne, if you want to say something, yeah.
I was just wondering, because those really big ports could push on the palate, and of course we've seen with the Byzantine examples that these can be very sort of damaging to the horse. But if there is more mouthpiece parts, they can already kind of prevent that rotation from going so far, even though that might press on the top bars of the horse's mouth, which might not necessarily be so nice, but better than breaking its palate, maybe. I don't know. But it might need some further investigation. It was a question because I didn't know the answer.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Timothy, I think you were raising a hand, or was it an accident? Feel free to speak if you have something. No?
Sorry, it was an accident. I was trying to find out why I can't see any of the chat.
Okay.
Carry on.
Right.
Okay. But perhaps you know something about Byzantine bits?
No, it's not an area I've specifically looked into. There's so little reliable archaeology that I don't actually know of any that have been properly authenticated. So I'd be interested to hear if anyone else does as well.
Okay.
I don't know if people are aware of it, or maybe Frederik, you are aware of it, but some time ago there was a publication about a Balkan shanked bit. I don't know if you know about this. I think I have a picture, but probably it was John Clark who sent it to me, and he would know more about it.
Okay.
If you want to know more, I can try and find this image. I just remember there was a picture and it was described as a Balkan.
If you find it, just send it me per mail
Okay.
or Facebook or something. But I think if we just shortly come back to what Arne said, I mean, the problem is that the archaeological record is so scarce. We simply don't have that many specimens to make really very reliable assumptions. But I think it is interesting when we look at in comparison, many examples from the 11th century of which none has these stop knobs. So maybe we trace in that line of development that they came up with this mechanism that makes the bits really harsh, and they, as we've seen with these Byzantine horse skulls, they realized, well, maybe we went a bit too far and we have to de-weaponize the bits again, until they came up with this system again. Yeah, I really would love to get further specimens of the time frame from the 9th to the 13th century, so that our assumptions could be more reliable about the development of this stop knob mechanism, the disappearance of it, and the redevelopment or the reuse of this mechanism again. So that's an area where I personally am still not that sure about, but it's interesting nonetheless to see that the archaeological records that we have seem to indicate that they try to make the bits milder around the turn of the millennium, and then made them not necessarily harder, but directer. And in the end, in the 14th century, with the invention of instant leverage action, that is not necessarily the wish to make the bits harsher and harder, but to make them simply more direct.
Okay, thank you. So I'll just show this. I found the picture. I don't know if it's of interest or not. And then Emil has a raised hand, and then Xavier could be next. So, so that's the picture I have of this Balkan curb, which was sent to us some time ago. I know if you're interested, I can send it to your email.
Yeah, sure. Please. Thank you.
Yeah, and I don't have the reference, but I can look it up. It's somewhere in my email. It's been sent quite a while ago. Okay, so how do I come back? Right. So we have 3 people with their raised hands. So let's do the order they raised hands. So Emil, Xavier, and then Jennifer. So Emil, you are the first. You can unmute.
Zou je even die bericht kunnen uitzetten? Want ik heb de indruk dat die voor heel wat tegenlicht zorgt.
Zet u metaal op de achtergrond?
Ja, maar dat eruit.
Oh, do you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, I guess.
So yeah, micro propal.
Well, thanks for having this. But I wanted to add something about like spade bits. I tried to ride a spade bit a whole lot. I ride like bowsoles, and then I make the terrain, and then I make straight up bridle horses with spades. Then the spades is.
I think you are frozen.
On the bit is 9 centimeters. So the port is actually as high as the bit has leverage. And that actually gives a lot of the guys. But I'm getting it.
You're breaking off all the time.
Weird.
Perhaps you could speak without a camera. Sometimes the video eats away at signal.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let's try this then. Will it work better?
Yes.
Nice. So where did you guys lost me?
About the port being as high as the bit has leverage.
Yeah. And like I ride with a lot of guys, buckarooing and cowboying, and like we have it almost is like a problem that the horse takes the mouthpiece and goes and bucks and runs off with you guys. So there is something about that when you have that port, that tall port, and that same tall port as the leverage that the horse can take the mouthpiece from you, and you can't make that bit rotate and giving him signal pressure or anything. He can take the bit from you and go. So when you see all these pictures of tall ports, you have to think again that the horse can grab that with his tongue, and he can hold that against you as the rider. So he can actually protect himself from you in the rough and tumble of war when you have that kind of high port.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. That's an interesting angle.
So Xavier was the next one. You can unmute and speak.
Xavier, unmute yourself.
Muted.
Yeah, I was muted. Yeah, I just wanted to weigh in on this 11th century thing a bit again, and it's giving a little bit of a preview of a lecture that I'm planning to give at the Roosvechten Symposium at Arnes, if it ever is going to happen again. I don't think that when we're looking at bits and how these bits develop, and particularly the 11th century, because in terms of medieval knighthood, this is a rather fundamental period, around the year 1000, and people knowing a little bit about medieval historiography will recognize that. It's l'an 1000, it's Duby's thesis of the emergence of knighthood. So one of the things that I studied in the origination of knighthood is that this actually happens in several phases, but around the year 1000, we actually see a development in horsemanship where you have a lot more fighting horse against horse, where we also see in the iconography a significant change towards these terre-à-terre type movements and these more hyper form of collections. So these longer shanks that you have here may be related to this kind of more hyper collected movements that we see originating. And I would therefore be very, very careful in calling bits harsh or light. I would rather think that you have to look at what the biomechanical effect is of the mechanisms and which kind of horsemanship this results in. And in that sense, it's really interesting, and this is a real preview, to see that in that same period, we actually see an influx of genes from Sassanid Persian horses. There's a research in 2019 that actually has shown that. They're still very uncertain from where it came. And that's actually one of the things I'm investigating, is that it's possibly true Byzantine horses. And we actually, when we look at ivory depictions, we actually already see those shank bits. And when you even go further back into Persian horsemanship, not only the Sassanid Persian, but even far way back, we actually see these very, very large shank bits. And we also see the development of more collected riding styles, which are depicted in Persian times, even centuries before Christ. So there's an interesting link and an interesting parallel between the development of these harsher bits and hyper-collected movements. So that's just something that's worth thinking about. And that's also explains my early question about the Byzantines, because I'm still looking in that as well.
Okay, thank you for this. It's interesting. And Jennifer also had some comment. And somebody is asking for a reference on this influx of Sassanid horses. I think we're all
Fergus.
Maybe you could just type it in the chat, so it stays there. And yeah, Jennifer, you are free to speak.
Let me unmute. So when the stop knobs appear, the lower bar straightens, because you showed the very curved, almost the 90-degree bar on the bits without the stop knobs, and then the stop knobs appear and the lower bar appears to straighten, or the shanks, what will become the shanks, appear to straighten. You still have the bar across the bottom, but it no longer has any action under the chin, I would presume, and instead we see the curb bar, the metal curb bar. Is that more or less? Did I get that progression? Or is that the progression that did I understand that progression correctly?
No, yeah, that's absolutely correct. As soon as the stop knobs appear, the contact in the chin groove is made via the curb bar or curb chain. So you don't have to use these angled lower shanks anymore. What happens as soon as the stop knob appears is that the lower shanks straighten up. As you said, they don't have to be angled anymore, and they also tend to get longer. They are still rather short ones, but they tend to get longer, and this leads up, at least from the iconographic record, to the 14th century, when the shanks of the hinge bits get really long, especially with these bits with the B-shaped mounts on the purchase. They have, for example, the bit from the Museo Stiberg in Florence, and other examples, and also the artwork of these 14th century B-shaped mounts, B-shaped mount bits have extremely long shanks, and there we often see this what is very often recited with the later Renaissance writing, with pressing the shanks against the chest of the horse that we already see in the 14th century, like in this Matamoros illumination that I showed.
And is there any evidence of a curb, the curb bar, the curved metal curb bar without stops?
I am not really. I would have to check my catalog and again, but actually I'm not really sure, because without the stop knobs, and when you can't really, I mean, we've talked about that with these early hinge bits. When you pull up the reins and you have mouthpiece movement, it's hard to describe, but it's not because the bit gets pressed up by the stop knob, but more or less because you pull the lower end of the mouthpiece down, and therefore it raises, but it's not an up pressing action. So actually, from a mechanical point of view, and from the extant specimens that we have, if there is a bar, the shanks have stop knobs.
All right, cool. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions, comments, ideas how to take this further? So I think we have like time for 1 or 2 last minute questions or comments, but otherwise a lot to take in. And I agree, it's a fascinating talk, and there simply isn't just enough data on these types and what they're doing to horses, what effects they have. So there are so many myths about the effects.
Yeah, I mean, sorry. In the end, we would need proper reconstructions, proper horses, proper schooled horses, and also properly schooled riders that who can use these bits properly, and only then we probably could get good results and data about the way these bits work. I mean, if you would put a proper reconstruction in my hands, I mean, I can sit on a horse and get transported, but I'm not really riding it on a level like Arne and other people do. So that wouldn't get us good results in data. So it's really hard to simply put up the experimental parameters to a scale where we get reliable results. So the thing that I'm trying to do with my work right now is, from a simple archaeological, technological, typological point of view, collect all the stuff that we have, sort it typologically, and then put it out there, and you guys will have to do the further thinking.
Yes, well, first we need accurate data to make a reconstruction, because otherwise it would be something quite fantastic. I don't think we necessarily need a well-schooled horse, because Rufus says you put these bits on a horse which never had a bit. So that's one thing. So you can try a variety of horses, including those young horses which have never been beaten before. Probably need an experienced rider as well. But on the other hand, we don't know how good medieval people were. Some of them are probably very experienced. Some of them are not very experienced. At some point, you start as a young knight and you start riding. Probably there would have been like kids or youngsters riding as well with the same bits. I don't think they used snaffles for children. So it would be interesting to have a wide variety of people and horses. Also, in my experience, people often think that to have a war horse, you need a horse which has like some special schooling for this. We currently have 2 horses which I'm riding, and both came to me because their owners couldn't ride them because they were a sort of problem horse. One is a 4-year-old, which has recently, which started being ridden like somewhere in March, but not regularly, and I started riding him in July. And now my husband, who comes to ride once a week, we can do sparring on him, and he's okay. And he came to me as a problem horse, and everybody was saying, "Oh, this is the troublemaker." He's not. He's like very nice family horse, I guess. And the other mare we use, she's 20 years old and she's blind. And to make things worse, I think she's not totally blind. She says something, and at first she was scared of other horses because she was bullied a lot. And then she totally went into it. It's just like, after our second or third sparring session, she was like, "Oh yeah, that's nice. Okay, no one is biting me, so why not chase this guy?"
Yes.
So, and I'm not a dressage rider either, and we are not using any like special equipment. So horses go for this.
Yes.
Don't need a specially schooled horse. But of course, well-schooled horse would respond even better, I guess. Yeah, so it would be interesting to have reconstructed bits and try them with a variety of riders, horses, and just see what the results are. Careful, of course.
Mm-hmm.
So people are leaving, so we can kind of wrap it up. I would like, let's all thank Frederik for this fascinating talk, and I'm sure everyone has learned a lot. I did, certainly. I've never seen so many varieties of curved bits and shanked bits in my life.
Thank you for having me. But as I said, there are lots of aspects to talk about medieval bit industry. For example, the bit makers and their industry, how they appear in the sources. That's another very, very interesting complex. And besides from the Hippiatric treatises, how these bits appear in the sources, in inventories and stuff, how they are called. And yeah, there are lots of interesting aspects. So maybe we will find another day to talk about that. But thanks anyway for having me, and thank you all for the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I have 2 last minute announcements. So one is we've been, me and Timothy have been organizing horse history sessions at the International Medieval Congress for 5 years probably. And we have 2 sessions for the next IMC and the roundtable on horse breeding. Well, as you probably know, you should all be medievalists. You know the IMC is online this year. We have one vacancy because one of the presenters doesn't do online events, and she warned us. Gail says she's not going online. So if anybody wants to join us in a session called Practical Equestrianism, if you're not given a paper at the IMC you want to join, please email me. And also at the roundtable, if somebody wants to join and speak about horse breeding in the Middle Ages, you're welcome. You can do it even if you are given a paper at the IMC. There is no limit on how many roundtables you can join. But you can only give one full paper. And then the next seminar is about gendered equestrianisms. So not only medieval, but also non-medieval. And this will be in February. So there will be an event, and Edgar will do it, so the time will be correct. He's the one who knows how to manage Facebook events. If somebody is interested in joining one of the next seminars as a speaker with a short 10-15 minute paper about something, you are still welcome. So we have one about gender equestrianism, then about art, then about something social role of horses, but this one is full, I guess. And then in May we have horses in like classical canon literature. We could change a little bit to canon culture, I guess, if you want to, but please feel free to take part. And if you have any ideas for further seminars or events online, probably not offline yet. Well, Frederik emailed me or messaged me and suggested having a lecture, so I totally open to have additional events, workshops, day schools, whatever, about horse history. Okay, so thank you for giving this lecture. It was totally fascinating.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, thanks. So we'll see you in a month's time, and thank you for joining, for your questions, and for being here, people. Bye.
Bye.
How do I stop recording? Don't know.
Stop recording.
Okay.